Imagine you're trying to get a loan from the world's most powerful bank, but you're not asking for money. You're asking to borrow a small, sealed box that runs on, 90% weapons-grade uranium.
Not exactly a standard loan application.
Not at all. And you promise you'll just use it to power a submarine. And you also explain that for security reasons, no international inspectors can ever be allowed to look at it for its entire 20-year lifespan.
Right, yeah.
This is basically the conversation South Korea is trying to have with the United States right now.
And following that recent summit, you can feel the excitement in Seoul. It's almost palpable.
Oh, absolutely. There's all this talk of building new ships in U.S. yards, of finally joining this, elite club of nations with nuclear-powered submarines. It almost feels like a done deal.
But it's so much more complicated than that. This isn't like buying a fighter jet.
Not even close. This is technology the U.S. has shared just once since the 1950s with the U.K., and now, with Australia through the AUKUS Pact.
A huge exception.
And as Seoul is starting to find out, getting that yes isn't about the price tag. It's about navigating four massive, almost invisible roadblocks that start with America's deepest fears about trust, technology, and what happens if that tech falls into the wrong hands.
That analogy, the bank loan, it just perfectly captures the gravity of this. We're talking about nuclear-powered attack submarines, SSNs, and the technology transfer involved is, like you said, it's almost unprecedented outside of that very special U.S.-UK relationship.
Right.
So for South Korea, the ROK, this isn't just some item on a defense procurement wish list. This is a fundamental structural realignment that gets right to the heart of global security protocols.
So that's our mission for this deep dive then, to unpack these four roadblocks.
Exactly. This isn't just a discussion about defense spending. It's about these massive geopolitical trade-offs. We'll look at the risk of escalation, the legal straitjacket of non-proliferation, the really intense strategic choices it forces on Seoul, and then the incredible economic lock-in the ROK is engineered to try and secure this deal.
It sounds like a story where industrial dependency becomes the ultimate guarantee.
That's precisely what it is.
Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with the biggest concern, which is just regional stability. I mean, we're talking about a decision that could really escalate the arms race in Northeast Asia.
Profoundly.
Before we even get to what Beijing or Pyongyang think, what does getting an SSN actually mean for someone just, living on the Korean peninsula?
It creates what you could call a major threat perception paradox. For South Korea, the whole idea is deterrence, right? Projecting power, ensuring they can survive against a nuclear North Korea.
Sure, that makes sense.
But the act of getting it, the visibility of it, the strategic meaning of it, that can inadvertently make the immediate danger even worse.
I found this perspective that just summarized the sphere so perfectly. It was from a South Korean businessman in Seoul, just a short drive from the DMZ. He is talking about this new push for nuclear subs. And he said that, of course he wants his country to be strong. But when he looks at this specific technology, he just feels this sense of dread. He said something like, the ROK is caught between North Korea's madness and China's shadow.
Wow. That's a powerful way to put it.
It is. He worries that getting these SSNs doesn't actually make his family any safer. And that anxiety is rooted in a very stark reality, isn't it?
It is, because a nuclear submarine is not a purely defensive tool.
Yeah.
It is an offensive, strategic power projection platform.
Exactly. And that's how he framed it. He said he fears it's like being a smaller person in a really rough neighborhood who goes out and buys this huge visible weapon. It doesn't actually scare the bullies. It just makes them see him as a bigger threat. It escalates the tension, and it ensures that if a fight ever does start, they're going to hit him first and they're going to hit him hardest because they assume he has some secret ace up his sleeve.
That captures the core tension perfectly. Does this deter an enemy, or does it just paint a bigger target on your back and speed up the arms race?
And that local fear, that's basically a mirror of the formal concerns that China is expressing, just on a much, much larger scale.
Oh, absolutely. Beijing is not being subtle about this at all. They see the ROK's ambition through the lens of U.S. strategic posture.
So what has Beijing actually warned about? What are the specifics?
Well, the Chinese ambassador, Dai Bing, he issued a rare public and very pointed warning. He stated explicitly that SSN cooperation between the U.S. and the ROK goes way beyond just bilateral defense interests.
Okay, so it's not just business between two countries.
Not in their view. Beijing directly tied the SSN decision to the international non-proliferation regime and to regional peace and stability. They urged Seoul to handle it. And this is the word they used, prudently.
Prudently. So they're worried about the new capabilities, but they're framing it, legally and diplomatically under this banner of non-proliferation.
Precisely. But the real underlying strategic concern is that Beijing sees this as a deepening of the U.S.-ROK alliance that is specifically designed to counter China's own maritime power. The implication is that this SSN is a platform for much deeper operational integration with the U.S. Navy in theaters far beyond the Korean Peninsula.
And when you say far beyond, are we talking about the Taiwan contingency?
That is the absolute central fear. The ambassador's message was unambiguous. China will express, quote, serious concerns if the alliance, now beefed up with these highly mobile, long-range capabilities like an SSN, interferes in a Taiwan contingency.
He said that explicitly.
He explicitly warned against adding fuel to the fire when it comes to Taiwan. So if the ROK's new strategic platform is seen as a tool for American power projection into the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, it fundamentally changes China's security calculation about South Korea itself.
Wow.
Yeah.
That puts South Korea in just an incredibly difficult position, trying to balance its alliance commitments with, the need to avoid becoming an explicit target for China over an issue like Taiwan.
And while that's happening, North Korea is already using this whole development to justify its own military agenda.
Of course. Their reaction was immediate, right?
Immediate and hostile. Just days after the U.S. Defense Secretary visited Seoul, North Korea fired a ballistic missile off its east coast. Their state media accused the U.S. of intentionally escalating the political and military tension in the region. They're essentially pointing to the ROK's nuclear ambition as proof that the U.S. alliance is inherently aggressive.
And they're not just talking, they're actually pursuing nuclear subs too, as part of their long-term plan.
That's right. As part of Kim Jong-un's 5-year plan for national defense, which came out in January 2021, the strategic goal of deploying nuclear submarines was explicitly included. This isn't just talk.
They're actively working on it.
Actively working on it. And even more worrying, South Korean intelligence suggests that Russia may have supplied North Korea with 2 or 3 nuclear submarine modules salvaged from old decommissioned Russian subs.
Nuclear submarine modules. Is the intelligence clear on the context for that? What's the thinking there?
The speculation is that this could be part of the quid pro quo. Pyongyang is supplying Moscow with huge amounts of arms and artillery for the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
This could be the payback.
So it's a trade.
It looks like it. And acquiring Russian modules would give Pyongyang a massive shortcut in reactor development and hull design. It would just significantly accelerate their path to fielding their own SSN, or at least a very advanced conventional sub based on nuclear design.
So if Seoul gets U.S. nuclear subs and Pyongyang is getting Russian nuclear modules, the whole strategic balance just gets thrown out of whack.
Fundamentally destabilized.
Yeah.
And that's before we even talk about the other major U.S. ally in the region. Japan. The ROK's SSN pursuit has already created a significant contagion risk there. The debate about boosting Japan's own naval capabilities, including nuclear propulsion, has been reignited with an intensity we have not seen in decades.
So they're openly talking about nuclear propulsion in Tokyo. That is a truly seismic shift for a country like Japan.
Absolutely seismic. And you have to understand why. Japan has this unique historical constraint, this profound national trauma of being the only nation to suffer nuclear attacks. For decades, they've held to their 3 non-nuclear principles: not to produce, possess, or host nuclear weapons.
Which has made any kind of nuclear defense option politically untouchable.
Exactly. Radioactive, you could say.
Yeah.
Regardless of any military necessity.
But the U.S. decision on the ROK seems to have broken that political firewall.
It's given powerful ammunition to the security hawks in Tokyo. We saw the newly appointed Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, unveil a defense plan that included a push for next-generation submarines with advanced propulsion capabilities.
Advanced propulsion, that's the code word, isn't it?
It is. In the naval world, when you're talking about long-duration, high-speed operations, advanced propulsion almost exclusively means nuclear power.
And their defense minister was even more direct.
Oh, yes. Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi pointed right at the worsening regional security environment. He noted, very pointedly, that all surrounding countries have them, referring to the nuclear subs operated by China and Russia. He basically argued that Tokyo has to debate whether it can afford to stick only to diesel subs anymore. It's no longer about preference, it's about strategic necessity.
Hold on a minute. If the U.S. approving an SSN for South Korea directly triggers Japan to speed up its own nuclear naval debate, Doesn't that fundamentally undermine American efforts to keep the region stable?
That is the core paradox.
It seems like the U.S. is creating a mini arms race between two of its most important allies.
That's the risk. The goal is to strengthen South Korea, but the side effect is to complicate security relationships across the board. If Japan pursues its own SSN, it would pull huge resources away from other defense needs, and it would give Beijing an even greater justification for its own naval buildup. The U.S. decision has basically opened a Pandora's box of regional security dynamics that will be incredibly hard to seal back up.
And that geopolitical headache leads us right into the second roadblock, which is maybe the most technically complex one. The integrity of the global nuclear non-proliferation regime.
Right.
The concern here is less about the immediate politics and more about the technical and legal precedent this whole deal sets for the entire world.
Precisely. And this all centers on two technical problems. What fuel is used and how the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, is prevented from verifying its use. This is where we run into the legal concept of the naval loophole in the non-proliferation treaty framework.
Okay, let's start with the legal part. How is any military use of nuclear material allowed in the first place, and why does the IAEA have to just look away?
So the core legal problem comes from something called paragraph 14 of INFCRC 153. That's the document that governs safeguards for non-nuclear weapon states like South Korea.
And under the treaty, those states have to accept IAEA safeguards inspections, verification on all their peaceful nuclear activities.
Correct. So civilian facilities like power plants, they use low-enriched uranium, or LEU, which is usually under 5% U-235. And those facilities are subject to constant IAEA inspection. Cameras, seals, checks, 24/7, 365. The IAEA knows exactly where every gram of that material is.
But naval reactors are on military sovereign vessels.
They are. And paragraph 14 allows for the non-application of those safeguards, while the nuclear material is in what's called non-prescribed military use.
The loophole.
That's the loophole.
Right.
It was designed out of necessity, really, to protect sensitive military information, things like reactor design, and critically submarine deployment schedules and patrol routes. You can't have the IAEA on a military vessel at sea.
So the IAEA is basically being asked to just trust the state for 2 or 3 decades that the material, once it's loaded, won't be diverted.
That's the legal tightrope. Safeguards are only suspended while the material is actively in the submarine. All the processes before enrichment, fabrication, and after storage disposal are technically supposed to remain under full safeguards. The problem is, once that fuel is loaded into a sealed reactor core, the IAEA can't verify its status for 20 or 30 years. That huge gap in verification is the first challenge.
And the second, more dangerous problem is the fuel itself, because the U.S. uses weapons-grade uranium.
Exactly. The dilemma gets much, much deeper because American nuclear subs typically run on highly enriched uranium, HEU, sometimes enriched to weapon-grade levels, around 93% U-235.
And that's different from what other countries use.
Very different. Russia uses HEU, but at lower levels, maybe 20–50%. China and France use LEU, which is a much lower risk. Transferring any HEU to a non-nuclear weapon state is where the real proliferation fear comes from.
Okay, let's just define that. Why is HEU so terrifying compared to LEU?
It comes down to something called breakout time. Breakout time is the minimum time a country would need to convert its safeguarded nuclear material into a nuclear weapon.
I see.
If a country is enriching LEU for a power plant, they still need a lot of infrastructure and time to refine that up to weapons-grade HEU. But if a state already has HEU, especially 90% plus, that material is almost instantly usable in a weapon. You skip the hardest and most detectable step, which is the enrichment process.
So by supplying HEU, even in a sealed reactor, the U.S. is creating a situation where a non-nuclear state has access, even if it's indirect, to weapons-usable material.
And that creates immense diplomatic strain. I heard this story about an internal meeting at the U.S. State Department where a career non-proliferation analyst was just grappling with the South Korean request.
And what was their concern?
It's interesting. This analyst wasn't worried that South Korea would misuse the technology. They completely trusted the ROK as an ally. Their fear was entirely about the precedent.
The domino effect.
The domino effect. They supposedly argued something like, look, the AUKUS deal was already a headache, but it involved 2 states with extremely high non-proliferation credentials. If we greenlight HEU for Seoul, we're explicitly saying that having a strong U.S. alliance is the only requirement for accessing weapons-grade material outside of IAEA's site.
And the question then becomes,
how do we then tell Japan or Turkey or Brazil, no, They felt they were essentially creating a new, legitimate pathway for non-nuclear states to access weapons-grade fuel. It really humanizes the pressure. The concern is that one yes could undermine decades of non-proliferation work.
We have to contrast this with AUKUS, though. AUKUS also involves HEU transfer, and it sort of established the principle. How would the ROK deal go further, legally speaking?
AUKUS and the ROK deal are likely built on the same core mitigation strategy to reduce that proliferation risk. And that strategy is the use of lifetime cores. This is the key technical solution to the whole dilemma.
Okay, so explain that. How do lifetime cores work, and why are they safer?
So in this model, the supplier, the U.S., loads the HEU fuel into the reactor ruts. The reactor is then designed so the fuel remains totally inaccessible for its entire 30-year operational life.
Built right into the hull.
Essentially, yeah. There are no refueling hatches. To get the fuel out, you would literally have to cut into the hull, which is a massive, months-long industrial project that would be immediately and obviously apparent to international scrutiny. Then, at the end of the vessel's life, the entire reactor and fuel unit gets returned to the U.S. for disposal.
So the HEU is physically and functionally locked away for 30 years. It's practically inaccessible. That minimizes the risk of the ROK diverting the imported fuel.
Correct. And that's the critical mitigating factor that allows the U.S. to argue the transfer is consistent with the goals of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But this leads to the ultimate proliferation risk that still remains.
Which is what, if it's not the imported fuel?
The major risk is if a non-nuclear state tries to produce its own naval fuel domestically. South Korea has expressed interest in this in the past, and Brazil is currently running an enrichment program with the goal of producing its own naval fuel.
So they'd be making their own HEU?
Well, Brazil says they're aiming for LEU, which is less risky. But any non-nuclear state producing its own HEU is seen as a direct, unmitigated threat to the regime, regardless of whether they say it's for naval or civilian use.
Because once a state has the capacity to enrich uranium to, say, 20 or 50% for naval use, moving to 90% for weapons use is just a political decision, not a technical one.
Exactly. The international community, including the IAEA, is very clear that the spread of enrichment capabilities is a huge problem and should be stopped, especially the production of HEU by any non-nuclear weapon state. AUKUS sets a positive precedent by showing a state can get SSNs without starting its own enrichment program. If South Korea follows that imported lifetime core model, the physical risk is minimized, but the diplomatic and political precedent of HEU access, that remains the core challenge.
Okay, so beyond these immense legal and geopolitical nightmares, we have to look at the cold, hard military reality for South Korea. Are these SSNs even the best tool for the job? This brings us to the strategic trade-off.
And this is a classic defense budget dilemma.
It forces Seoul to decide how to spend its money. Do they go for the high-profile, technologically sophisticated, the exquisite platforms, or do they address these critical but maybe less glamorous foundational needs like logistics and troop mobility?
It's a huge question.
I remember reading this really illuminating perspective from a defense journalist who spoke with a senior commander in the South Korean Navy. This was someone who had commanded their advanced non-nuclear submarines for years.
Well, that's a great source.
Yeah, and he expressed this really nuanced frustration. He said, an SSN is a marathon runner. It can run forever. My boat is a sprinter, powerful, silent, but it must breathe.
That analogy just perfectly defines the operational difference in the core trade-off.
It does. He explained that for the defense of the Korean Peninsula, what he needs is more sprinters. He needs the ability to patrol multiple choke points near North Korea at the same time and quietly track their fleet of over 70 submarines.
More boats in the water.
Exactly. For him, the debate about SSNs wasn't about prestige. It was about the crippling cost. He apparently said, for the price of one of these nuclear boats, I could have 3 or 4 advanced conventional boats in the water today protecting our shores. We are spending a fortune on a marathon runner when our fight is in our own backyard.
And that highlights the technical reality so well. Nuclear submarines, the SSNs, they're strategic assets. They're incredibly fast, about twice the speed of a conventional sub, and their endurance is only limited by the crew's food supply. They can sustain these continuous multi-month patrols across vast distances.
Perfect for shadowing Chinese fleets out in the Pacific.
Absolutely. But the sprinters, the advanced conventional submarines with air-independent propulsion, or AIP, they are incredibly silent when they're running on battery. That makes them excellent for coastal defense and operating in the confined, noisy waters around the Korean Peninsula.
But they have that limitation. Their submerged time is limited, right? To about a month before they have to surface or snorkel to recharge.
Exactly. And that's why the SSN is a strategic luxury for the RAK Navy's primary mission. It's powerful, but it imposes this massive opportunity cost on the ROK's defense budget. It could consume resources that would be better spent on achieving core defense objectives, especially against that immediate asymmetrical North Korean threat.
So what are those foundational capability areas that South Korea is lacking right now, according to analysts like those at CSBA?
The Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, CSBA, highlights several glaring gaps. First and foremost is logistics. The ROK military needs to dramatically expand its logistics infrastructure to sustain a long, drawn-out conflict, especially if U.S. support is constrained by, say, a crisis in the Middle East or Eastern Europe at the same time.
So less focus on shiny new toys and more on making sure the existing army can actually be supplied and fight for longer than a few weeks.
Precisely. Secondly, they need to increase their ground force and strength for post-conflict stabilization operations if a reunification scenario ever happens. And third, and this is critical, they need rapid maneuver capabilities, new ground vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles, to let their forces move up through North Korea to the Yalu River as quickly as possible.
And that rapid advance to the Yalu, that's a crucial objective to preempt Chinese intervention, right?
It is the defining strategic objective of any ROK U.S. war plan for the peninsula. If ROK forces can't get to the Yalu quickly and secure that border, the risk of Beijing sending its own troops in to create a buffer zone goes up exponentially.
But funding an exquisite platform like an SSN or their planned light aircraft carrier, that diverts huge amounts of money away from these fundamental needs like logistics and ground mobility.
It does. And this tension was perfectly demonstrated in the CSBA Strategic Choices exercise, which forced ROK military planners to make these brutally difficult budget choices.
Right. Let's look at the divergent priorities of those two teams in the exercise. It's fascinating.
The exercise created two different future ROK military structures for 2031, both operating under a hard budget cap. The teams had to decide where to invest and where to cut.
So Team 1, for example, they prioritized asymmetric defense. Their focus was almost entirely on the North Korean threat and being prepared to fight independently, assuming U.S. forces might arrive late.
And this North Korea focus led to very clear, almost austere investment decisions. They invested heavily in things to detect and intercept DPRK missiles advanced systems like NASAMS, R&D in directed energy and electronic warfare, extensive cyber capabilities. And critically, they massively increased funding for hardened logistics and basing to ensure they could survive those first missile and artillery attacks from the north.
And the major cuts, where did they find the money for all that?
Team 1 made some huge divestments. Their calculation was brutal. They decided a light aircraft carrier is a prestige asset for power projection far from the peninsula, likely against China. Since their mandate was immediate defense against Pyongyang, they canceled the Navy's planned light aircraft carrier program entirely.
Wow.
They also cut back on buying fifth-generation fighters, arguing that the ROK would secure air superiority over North Korea easily anyway. Their motto was basically defense first, power projection never.
Okay, then you have Team 2. And they had a broader threat scope, right? They were concerned not just with North Korea, but also with the potential for Chinese military intervention.
Exactly. Team 2's goal was a quick victory to avoid a long conflict that might trigger China's involvement. This required massive mobility, so they focused their investments on things that would let the ROK armed forces advance north rapidly and occupy territory to preempt Beijing.
So what did they buy?
Their primary investments were in air and missile defense and huge stockpiles of long-range precision fires munitions that could target armored units. They also heavily invested in ground assets, like infantry fighting vehicles and unmanned ground vehicles, specifically to maximize mobility on that northern advance.
And what was their naval approach? Did Team 2 cut the SSN?
This is the crucial part. They chose to counter long-term threats from China with conventional attack submarines and underwater drones. But crucially, Team 2 chose not to terminate any major platforms in development, including the carrier or the SSN ambition.
But by keeping that SSN dream alive, they had less money for immediate needs.
Exactly, which forced them to rely more on the U.S. for logistics and sustainment.
So Team 1 said SSNs are a luxury we can't afford if we want to survive an initial attack. And Team 2 said SSNs are vital for long-term deterrence, even if it makes us weaker on the ground in the short term. This just shows the fundamental strategic split inside Seoul's defense establishment.
It shows the difficult choice perfectly. Do you fund the exquisite SSN dream, a symbol of great power projection? Or do you focus entirely on the necessary, immediate capabilities needed for peninsular defense and winning that race to the Yalu River? The SSN is an incredible platform, but it could be a massive distraction from the tactical realities facing the ROK military today.
So if the first three roadblocks, geopolitics, non-proliferation, and strategic utility, all raise these serious, maybe even prohibitive questions, how is it that the SSN deal is moving forward so quickly and with such confidence from Seoul?
The answer is in the fourth roadblock. And it's that the ROK didn't just ask for a favor. They structured the deal as an industrial, too intertwined to fail transaction. It's really an act of industrial fusion that's designed to eliminate the political and strategic risk for the United States.
So this SSN approval wasn't a gift at all. It was the dividend of this huge, mutually beneficial industrial transaction where South Korea came in as a strategic partner, not a supplicant.
Absolutely. President Lee Jae-myung understood the transactional nature of U.S. diplomacy. He capitalized on the whole America first necessity for allies to shoulder more responsibility and, crucially, to shore up America's own industrial base.
And the price was a lot more than just the cost of the subs.
Oh, it was a massive $350 billion investment package. This included $150 billion specifically for shipbuilding cooperation, and the rest heavily concentrated in critical sectors like semiconductors.
So South Korea is essentially integrating its industrial power directly into the U.S. economy, specifically in the defense sector.
It is a profound industrial merger. It dismantles that old framework where South Korea tried to keep economic ties with China while relying only on the U.S. for security. Now, South Korea is physically embedding its defense industrial base with the U.S. to form a single strategic economic bloc.
And this industrial fusion solves a massive, chronic, and right now critical problem for the U.S. Navy.
It solves America's shipbuilding crisis. The U.S. defense industry is struggling immensely to meet its own naval production quotas. I mean, the goal of building 2 Virginia-class submarines per year is dangerously off schedule. The U.S. shipbuilding sector is just lagging so far behind China in scale and efficiency, and that's creating a major strategic vulnerability.
And South Korea is offering to fill that capacity gap with its world-class manufacturing expertise.
Exactly. South Korea's Hanwha Group, which is known for being one of the world's most efficient shipbuilders, committed $5 billion to revitalize the Hanwha Philly shipyard in Pennsylvania.
And this isn't just cash, is it?
Not at all. It's expertise, it's management, it's efficiency that the U.S. desperately needs. The Lowy Institute did an analysis that pointed out the sharp difference. AQUS, which gives Australia SSNs, actually strains U.S. resources. The ROK deal, by contrast, replenishes them by bringing capital and unparalleled industrial efficiency to American shores. The SSN approval is the dividend for rescuing a critical American industry.
This whole structure seems designed explicitly to make the alliance resilient to the rapid political swings we see in Washington. It feels like it's engineered for lock-in.
It is the ultimate strategic lock-in. The agreement is designed to create irreversible interdependence by making it politically and economically impossible for a future administration or Congress to cancel.
Okay, let's look at the congressional hurdle first. Amending the U.S. ROK Civil Nuclear Agreement, the 123 agreement, that requires congressional review. Lawmakers could potentially block it.
They could try. But the way the investment package is distributed, opposing the SSN deal becomes politically self-destructive for Congress. How can a member of Congress vote no when that vote means rejecting the revitalization of the Philadelphia shipyard, terminating thousands of highly skilled jobs in a key swing state like Pennsylvania, and at the same time weakening the U.S. Navy's ability to compete with China?
It's structured so that opposing the nuclear transfer requires rejecting billions in domestic investment.
Exactly. It's politically self-destructive.
That is truly ingenious. It leverages domestic political necessity to secure a high-level strategic goal. But the second hurdle, the future administration hurdle, is maybe even more critical given how unstable political cycles can be.
And that's the real genius of the lock-in. The deal is grounded in industrial reality, not in personal political trust between two presidents. By the time a new administration takes office, the supply chains will be thoroughly intertwined, billions of dollars will be sunk in capital investment, and crucially, South Korean naval personnel will be embedded deep within U.S. nuclear training programs. Training a crew for a nuclear sub takes years. You can't just stop that process.
So if a future president wanted to cancel the SSN part of the deal, they would essentially be harming America's own defense capacity and jobs program.
That's it. Canceling the deal at that point would effectively sabotage the U.S. Navy's ability to build its own fleet of submarines. It would severely damage domestic employment in key industrial states. And it would hand Beijing a huge strategic victory by showing that Washington can't honor long-term commitments to its allies.
I have to challenge that, though. Are you saying the U.S. has become structurally dependent on South Korea to maintain its own power? It's almost like the tail wagging the dog. Is that sustainable, or will the U.S. eventually try to claw back that leverage once its own shipyards, revitalized by ROK money, are back online?
That is the long-term question. The immediate lock-in is robust. It's designed to survive at least 2 administration changes. But you're right, if the U.S. military-industrial base achieves self-sufficiency again, the ROK loses its primary leverage. However, the nature of modern supply chains, especially in something as complex as defense manufacturing, suggests that total isolation is impossible. The ROK's expertise in modular construction and rapid fabrication, which is what the U.S. needs to beat China's production speed, that will remain valuable. The dependency might evolve, but the intertwining, the too intertwined to fail nature of this bloc is designed to be permanent.
So the risk is no longer that Washington will abandon Seoul, but that the United States has become structurally dependent on South Korea just to sustain its own maritime power. The nuclear-powered submarine is the symbol, but industrial fusion is the irreversible reality. So we've just done a deep dive into these 4 immense roadblocks facing South Korea's pursuit of nuclear-powered attack submarines. What we've seen here is really a masterclass in strategic maneuvering by South Korea.
Yeah.
They're going after SSNs, this exquisite high-cost asset, by leveraging U.S. industrial necessity. They're securing a nuclear capability by anchoring the alliance not in abstract trust, but in shared economic and industrial interdependence. They've successfully bypassed all these traditional political hurdles by making the deal just too beneficial and too costly to reverse for the U.S.
However, the path ahead is still fraught with geopolitical risk and non-proliferation sensitivity. While that industrial lock-in is robust, Seoul still faces the daunting challenges of navigating the non-proliferation regime and maintaining global acceptance of the HEU precedent set by ROUs and now, potentially, the ROK.
And internally, they still have that big trade-off to justify.
They do. Internally, South Korea has to continually justify the enormous opportunity cost of pursuing this SSN dream against its immediate fundamental defense needs. The logistics, the manpower, and the rapid maneuver capability they need for peninsular defense and winning that race to the Yalu. The ultimate security guarantee has fundamentally shifted. It's moved from one of strategic alliance to one of mutual, irreversible economic and industrial dependency.